old rugged cross. And let's see, D. On a hill far away stood an old rugged cross, the emblem of suffering and shame. And I love that old cross where the dearest and best for a world of lost sinners was slain. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. Oh, that old rugged cross, so despised by the world, has a wondrous attraction for me. For the dear Lamb of God left his glory above to bear it to dark Calvary. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. To the old rugged cross I will ever be true, its shame and reproach gladly bear. Then he'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share. So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. All right, 624, since Jesus came into my heart. What a wonderful change in my life has been wrought since Jesus came into my heart. There we go. I have light in my soul for which long I had sought since Jesus came into my heart. Since Jesus came into my heart, since Jesus came into my heart, floods of joy o'er my soul like the sea billows roll. Since Jesus came into my heart, I'm possessed of a hope that is steadfast and sure, since Jesus came into my heart. And no dark clouds of doubt now my pathway obscure, since Jesus came into my heart. Since Jesus came into my heart, since Jesus came into my heart, floods of joy o'er my soul like the sea billows roll. Since Jesus came into my heart, I shall go there to dwell in that city I know, since Jesus came into my heart. And I'm happy, so happy as onward I go, since Jesus came into my heart. Since Jesus came into my heart. Since Jesus came into my heart. Floods of joy o'er my soul, like the sea billows roll. Since Jesus came into my heart.
All right. Guess we are on. How are y'all doing? So what was your favorite thing that you read about this week, or a verse that stuck out to you? Yes, don't use the Lord's name in vain. Definitely not.
I'm just thankful I'm under grace and not under that law.
Definitely good to be under grace and not under the law, not having to keep all of those laws, and to know them all. Very, very specific. Yes, the priests were the ones that were in charge of that, but I think every single Jewish person had to know them, and so they would know exactly what they had to do and when and all of that. Lots of detail, yes. Very, very specific about everything. And there's a lot of repetition in it, because it'll say, like, okay, if they give a bull, then you need to do this, 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 and this. And if you give a goat, it's this, 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 and they're the very same things, but they repeat it anyway. So, yeah. And part of it, I think God repeated a lot because we are so hard-headed. It takes us a while to learn things. And maybe he repeated it for our benefit. Make sure we got it down really good. So what were the Urim and Thummim? Huh? The Urim and the Thummim. Right. I don't know exactly what they look like. I'm not sure that anybody does, but it would be very similar to like dice, from what I understand. They would drop it out and expect God to give them the answer and whatever question they had through that. And it wasn't about this being magical stuff. It was trusting God to make sure that whatever came up was His will, and He would do that. Why would they need that?
Because He's the only one who can give us an answer sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. Why don't we need it? They didn't have the Holy Spirit living in them. Yeah, we do. So we don't need something like that, because we can allow the Holy Spirit to speak directly to us and guide us and show us what it is that He wants us to do. They didn't have that back then, so this is one of the ways God used to teach them. Huh? I don't have any idea.
It's not a written word.
Right, I don't know.
So it makes sense. What if you need further explanation?
Yeah. I guess you ask different questions, more specific questions. I don't know. Like I said, don't really know how it was used or what it was. That's just what I've heard, that it was similar to like dice that you would toss out. When God saw the people worshiping the golden calf, He wanted to destroy them all and make a nation of Moses. But Moses asked Him to relent. What reason did Moses give?
Didn't want the Egyptians to
he wasn't able to do what he promised. Yeah. And yet a few verses later, Moses sees them and he gets really mad, and he calls on the Levites to punish them. What does that tell us about God? And then God punishes them with a plague. So what does that tell us about God? That he punished those people. Anything? Well, to me, it means that sin is serious. He means what he says, and sin is serious. And a lot of times we kind of blow it off sin. You know, we say, oh, I just stretched the truth, you know, or I did this. I borrowed somebody's answer, or I borrowed, you know, this, that, whatever. Sin is sin, and God is serious about it. It is an affront to him, and that's what's important. Moses went on to say there was one thing that set the Israelites apart from every other nation, and what was that? God's chosen people, but more directly, well, circumcision was a sign, yeah. The biggest thing was that God was with them. And when God said, okay, I can't go with you anymore, because if I do, I'm going to get mad and destroy y'all. So you just go on. I'll protect you. I'll send the angel ahead of you. And Moses said, don't. In Exodus 33:16, he says, how will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? And that's the fact that it's, God's with them, going with them. And that's what set them apart. There's a man named Bezalel, and he was given talents to build and to make all manner of things with metals and with clothing and with everything. He was very, very talented. Do you ever get envious of people that are more talented than you? Like Charlie? She's getting envious of you.
It makes you wonder, and I'm sure they probably have no talent in their life, but after they built everything that God needed, did they still do things like that in their life?
Maybe. Did he have a job doing that later? Could be, I don't know. I just, sometimes I think we get a little hint of jealousy, or maybe not jealousy, but we think, hey, I could do that just as well. But, not necessarily. And I, there's lots of people more talented than me. Duct tape and WD-40. Yeah, that's how I fix things too, yes. I tell everybody, I've played the guitar for several years. I got one when I first went to OBU and sold my trumpet and got a fairly good guitar. And there's a chord, it's an A chord. And to play it, the very number one string, the very bottom string, you don't touch it at all, but the next three strings you have to push down. I used to use these three, but anymore I have to use these three because they won't fit in there anymore. So I use these three. You know what my son does? He lays his finger down, one finger, but his finger bends backwards. So he can lay his finger down like that. It doesn't hit the high E, and he can hold those other three down with one finger. And I tell everybody he has more talent in his little finger than I have in my whole body, which is very true. The tabernacle, what is it a copy of? And later the temple, what is it a copy of? well, but the building itself, the tent itself, what is it a copy of? The one in heaven, that's right, the temple in heaven. And it has all of these different pieces of furniture. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you have the altar, you have the bronze laver, you have the candlestick, all of those things inside. And the closer you get to the Holy of Holies, the more gold is used. Bronze is outside, but the closer you get to the Holy of Holies, it's all going to be gold. And yes, and fewer people can get into it as closer you get there. And then the Holy of Holies, the mercy seat represents God's actual presence. And in fact, when they got the tabernacle finished and when they got the temple finished, God's presence, his Shekinah glory, came down and filled the temple, and they couldn't go in at all. Leviticus, one of the first things it talked about was unintentional sin. Is that something that God overlooks? No. There's probably not a whole lot of unintentional sin, because I think we all know better. And we do it anyway, so that would be intentional. What's the difference between clean, unclean, holy, and perfect? First, clean and unclean. What's the difference there? Is it sinful to be unclean? Right. Yes, you can't do anything, but it's not necessarily sinful. It's just something has happened. Maybe you've touched a dead body. Maybe, a close family member died and you went and put your hands on them weeping and whatever. There's a lot of different things. You might get a sickness, a disease of some kind that makes you unclean. It doesn't necessarily mean you're sinful. It's just, we live in a sinful world, and diseases happen, and sometimes you get sick. Sometimes something happens. Yeah. Right. Yeah. It was in the Bible, when it talks about leprosy, it's a whole lot of different skin diseases. It's not just Hansen's disease. But in Hansen's disease, one of the bad things is the nerves in your hands and your fingers, your toes, they go numb, and then you can't feel anything, and you get an infection. You don't know it because you don't feel anything, and then you end up getting gangrene, and you have to take the fingers off, and then hands, and so forth. And that's the biggest thing, even with Hansen's, from what I understand, is if they are very meticulous about cleaning, especially fingers and toes and stuff, it doesn't necessarily spread. Why did God have them separate themselves? Could be. There's some of that was contagious, and I think it was partly because he's a holy God, and and you gotta be, he wants us to be holy. What's the difference between holy and perfect? Well, they are. It could be looked at that. Yeah, you could look at it that way. It's being separated for God, separated as much as we can from sin. We are called a holy priesthood, a holy nation. The people of the children of Israel, they were a holy nation. They weren't perfect, but they were holy. They're set apart. We are set apart. We're not perfect. Only God is perfect. But we are to be holy. We are to set ourselves apart for him and follow him as much as we can. When the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, the first thing he did was offer a sacrifice for someone's sin. Whose? His own. Because he was sinful just like everybody else. So he had to atone for his own sin and then the sins of others. What did Nadab and Abihu do? What? Yeah, it's called, what is it called? Yes. Had something to do with the fire. They could have used the wrong mixture in preparing it. They could have taken the mixture that was only supposed to be for God and used it for something else. There's a lot of different possibilities, but they called it an something fire. I just gone blank. Anyone remember? Unauthorized fire, maybe? Strange fire? Right. Or, like a day or two later, she said it could have been that they entered the Holy of Holies instead of Aaron. That's another possibility because they take the censer of incense and stuff into that. So it could have been any of those kinds of things. What happened to them? They died, yeah, almost immediately. Yeah, I mean, and Aaron was told not to grieve for them. Yeah, why? Well, he did, but that's not why he couldn't grieve for him. He was already set apart, already gone through the cleansing and all of that stuff, and ordination part to go in to offer the sacrifice. And since he was already prepared for all of that, God said, you can't grieve. You can't, like everybody else. I know he's going to be sad. He's going to, have a lot of turmoil in his heart, but he couldn't, tear his robe, throw ashes on his head like they did back then to show grieving, because he was already sanctified or whatever to go into the Holy of Holies. What are the three kinds of laws? I know there's an article up here. Looks like I ran out of one of them. Laws. Yes. Ceremonial, the one I forgot. Moral and civil. Okay? What are ceremonial laws? Right? They have to do with the offerings and the temple, everything that had to do with their religion. Those were ceremonial laws. Keeping the Sabbath and doing these other things. Yes, they would be part of that. Okay? Do we still follow the ceremonial laws? Not necessarily. I mean, we could still hold the feast if we wanted to, but we do not do the sacrifice. Why? Yes, Jesus was the perfect sacrifice. So we don't do the sacrificial system anymore because Jesus paid that once and for all. And even in the Old Testament, it just kind of covered their sins. It didn't take their sins away. And that's why they had to keep doing it every year or every few weeks or months, some of them. They had to keep doing it over and over. That's ceremonial law. What about the civil law? Right. Between people, how you treat other people. Do we still follow the civil law? Or should we still follow the civil law? Yes and no. Yes, we should follow. I mean, most of it is in there, has to do with things that we ought to be following the law. The punishment, not necessarily. I mean, I think that was something that they did because they were set apart for God's purpose, and that's the nation of Israel. That was their national laws. Our nation has different laws, even though we might not agree with all of them. probably don't agree with a lot of them, but the punishments that were dealt out in the Old Testament are not necessarily the same things that we would do today. Yes, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Well, a lot of things about, if this happened, you need to kill them. There's a lot of capital punishment in the Old Testament, and our nation has gotten away from that completely, just about. Yes, yeah. And then the moral laws. What are they? Like the Ten Commandments? Mm-hmm. Right. Well, for the Jewish people, the evening was the end of that day and the beginning of the next. So it was kind of like, okay, for the rest of the day, you're going to be unclean. You wash yourself. And one of the examples of unclean I didn't think about, but when they offered the sacrifices on the altar, somebody had to take all of the ashes and take it outside the camp. Is that sinful? No. But that made them unclean until evening. So most of the uncleanness, other than leprosy, most of the other things were things that they would just, wash real good, and then they'd be come back. Right. Yeah. Well, the biggest thing was that they had to wash, clean up. And then I think it was just like, well, the rest of the day. And then tomorrow, you'll be clean. That's true. Right. Isolation, yeah. Right. Right. Yep. And a lot of that was to protect things from spreading. Well, then that would be between the priest and God. God would judge him very harshly if he didn't do exactly what the Bible taught. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Right. Don't know. By the way, on the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, one thing that I want to point out, it's the only one of the feast that's not a feast. It's a fast. It's the only one in which they are not celebrating. And it's because that is the day that the priest offers the sacrifice for their sins. And all of the others, it says, do no regular work, which means if you need to fix lunch or something along those lines, that's fine. No regular work would be going out and working in the field or stuff that way. On the Day of Atonement, it was no work, period. So, not a feast, it's a fast, and no work at all. Okay? And it's time. Any other questions or comments? That's why you had lots of sacrifices. And that's why the priests and the Levites never had to worry about food. I mean, you got 4 or 5 million people. I'm sure there was sacrifices, multiple sacrifices going on every day. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.